If you want to see how I built this awesome 4x4 Mordor board, keep watching. Hey guys, welcome to Battle Games Terrain Studio. My name's Hamish Meadows, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I built this awesome 4x4 board from the lands of Mordor. To start this board off, I decided to make a frame from these 4-foot pieces of pine, which should fit perfectly up against this 4-foot MDF board. For the side pieces, I marked up and cut 2 different lengths because the back piece overlaps the MDF on the left side. I then made sure everything lined up nice and neatly, and now it's time to attach it all together. I'm going to grab a marker, and I'm just going to mark about in the center of that along the pine. Or we mark on the higher side rather than the lower side, because if the screw does go in at a wrong angle, we want to make sure it's coming up into the board, because that way it's a lot easier to cover up later with plaster or something than if it's to go through the bottom of the board. Then it causes a whole issue. We have to fix it all up. Once I had marked out all the spots that needed screws, I then used a 3mm drill bit to make some pilot holes. This is a super important step because pine like this tends to split very easily. Alrighty, so the pilot holes have all been drilled through. Now the next thing we're going to do is attach some screws to hold this whole frame together. But before we do that, we want to make it a little bit stronger, and we're going to line the whole thing with some PVA. And you just want to use a little bit of PVA so it doesn't burst out all over. And attach the screws one at a time. Now that we have a nice solid frame, I'm going to run some sandpaper over the whole thing just so there isn't any rough or sharp edges that are going to annoy us later on. I went over the whole thing with a rough grit sandpaper, and then followed the same process with a finer grit sandpaper, just to make everything nice and smooth. So while the frame was all drying for the board, I decided to 3D print out a whole bunch of these different rocks. Kind of thinking we could have some higher sections with some rocks, and then I printed out some of these dead trees as well, so I'm not sure if we'll attach those or we'll just keep them as removable terrain. So I've decided that these rocks are just a little bit too large and we want to be able to store it away nice and flat. So what I'm going to do is keep these as removable terrain, and I'm going to cut some thin strips of foam. We're going to lay them down, some brick texture, make it look like an old weathered sort of ruined city, and then I can texture the rest of the board and still have a few nice smooth areas where we can put down scatter, but then it still isn't compromising having to make the whole board too flat. I then cut a whole heap of thin strips of foam. It doesn't have to be super accurate because we're going to be texturing it up next. Then I traced an outline for each piece of terrain I'm building a foundation for. Then using a knife, I scored each line to make a square flagstone pattern. Using a pencil, I then traced the lines, and using a rock or ball of aluminium foil, I started to then texture the foam. I wasn't completely sold on the texturing as it didn't look weathered and damaged enough, so I decided to use a knife and chip out the corners and slice some chunks. Then I used the flat side of a pencil to push down corners of the flagstones to give them a much more aged look. Now that the flagstones are looking awesome, it's time to put them down on the board and decide where everything's going to go. When referencing for this board, I wanted it to be set in the Southlands of Mordor, where there was once towns and fertility that has all now perished into ruin. I decided on this layout with a cliffside on the right and the 3 foundations scattered through the middle. This way, whether it's ruined buildings or these large rocks on the board, there's plenty of options in how it can be set out, and more importantly, it provides an even playing field from all sides. Now that I've glued all the foam down and it's all set, I need to make some access points, probably 2 to 3 I'm thinking. I think I'm gonna add some foam on one out, and then on the other side, I'm gonna cut into the foam. So it's not super unnatural with, you know, like 2 ramps coming down. One will be inwards and one will be outwards. For the ramp sections, I traced up a rough outline and then cut it out with the hot wire cutter. I then sliced it down the middle on a diagonal angle, and then I can use my second half as the internal ramp on the other side. Having the ramps facing the same direction ties in nicely with the elevation of the land and how the water would naturally run downhill. Because of this, I also decided to create a dried up creek bed that runs along the edge of the cliffs. Next up, I added some plaster rocks along the cliffside, placing them along the foam to get a rough idea before attaching them. I also decided to carve and texture the ramps first while they were easy to access. Then using liquid nails, I attached all the rocks. I had an idea to attempt making some cracked earth areas using these thin XPS tiles. I then cut them into pieces, opened them up just a little bit, and then attached them to the board in the same direction as the creek bed. Next up, I made some homemade modelling compound using plaster of Paris, water, and shredded tissue paper. It's important at this step to mix your plaster and water first, otherwise the tissue fibres absorb the water before it's properly mixed, leaving you with wet lumps of paper that take a lot longer to dry and to smooth out. I mixed these batches quite runny so I can just pour it out and smooth it over with my hand. It's really good to work in small batches so it dries in sections and you can stay on top of it. After 10 to 15 minutes, when it's about 50% dry, I then go over it again with a wet hand and smooth it out even more, just like clay. I also added some very watered down plaster over the top of all my foam foundations and foam rocks to hide any imperfections and to help strengthen the surface. Next, I used this dental tool called a flat plastic and some thicker plaster to patch in all the gaps in my cliff section. It's important to wet the plaster rocks a little bit first because they suck all the water out of your modelling compound and make it very hard to work with. Working on one gap at a time, I used this tool to blend all the rocks together into one seamless cliff face. Once everything is fully dry, it's time to start adding some ground texture. For that, I used some poly filler mixed with water to a paint-like consistency. I then decided to add some coarse sand. You don't have to add sand at this point, but I thought it would be a good way to roughen up the flat areas. Then I added some black paint as a base color. This way, if a small rock falls off with the finished project, it won't be an obvious white spot on the board. Then using my medium painter's brush, I stippled it everywhere except the flagstone foundations and the rocks. Once it had all dried, I realized that there was still some plaster streak lines that I should have sanded off before adding sand all over the top of it, but that's okay. I used some old sandpaper to try to clean up those lines. Then for the ground cover, I used a variety of different sized rocks, sand, and grout. First, I traced around all my removable terrain pieces to ensure I don't get any large rocks underneath. Then mixed up some watered down PVA glue, covered about a quarter of the board at a time, and then added all the rocks from biggest to smallest. For the larger rocks, I placed them strategically under the cliffs and next to the plaster rocks in small clusters. This makes it look like real rocks crumbling over time and also leaves plenty of flatter ground for our model bases. With all that down, it's really starting to come together. I then used a small brush to dust the grout off any rocks and other unwanted places. I also made sure to separate the boards and clean off any overhanging rocks or sand with my finger, just so that they don't break off later and cause an issue. I then covered the whole thing with isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA. The isopropyl is a crucial step as it breaks down the molecular barrier of the grout and lets the PVA soak all the way through, resulting in a rock-hard gaming surface. I repeated this process 3 times over a few days. Just make sure each coat is completely dry before adding more, otherwise you might end up with little white dots that never fully dry. Next up, I primed the whole board in a flat black, including my removable terrain pieces and also the timber frame. I used a piece of cardboard when spraying around the edges to catch any unwanted paint. Also, don't forget to wear a safety mask while using aerosol sprays. Next, I used a medium flat grey to base all the stone foundations, the cliffs, and the rocks. Then I did some patches with a chocolate brown. Using this natural grey, I did a heavy dry brush over all my terrain and then the whole board. After all that had dried, I mixed up a black-brown wash with these Liquitex inks, matte medium, and water. I don't really have an exact recipe, I just mix it until it flows like a Nuln oil. After I applied the black wash to the stone and the grey areas, I then mixed up a dark brown wash and put it all over. While the brown wash was still wet, I mixed up a greeny brown colour and I put it in all the open areas and in the creek bed, where the grass would have once grown when this was a fertile land of the Southlands. Once all the washes have dried, you can really see all those undertones showing through and it's starting to look awesome. Now I give everything a dry brush with neutral grey again, but this time pressing very lightly to avoid any streaks. Then I mixed a 50-50 of grey and some antique white to do a very light dry brush to start highlighting those rocks. I removed about 90% of the paint off the brush and then used a soft circular motion to catch all the sand and high spots. I followed all the same process with my removable terrain, so it should blend in perfectly. Then using a small square brush, I carefully went around the whole border with some black paint to tidy it up. For my last and absolute favourite step, I added in some grass tufts. I chose 4 colours to highlight this arid landscape, using the dry, autumn, mixed green, and golden meadow. These all range from 4mm to 6mm. I placed them randomly throughout the board, thinking of where grass would naturally grow in this landscape, so near rocks and cracks, where the water would gather, and under the shade of the cliffs. Once those tufts have dried, the board is now finished. I am absolutely stoked on how it turned out and had such a blast creating this little slice of Middle-earth. Choosing the Southlands part of Mordor was a very interesting choice, as there isn't too many references to go off, but I really enjoyed letting my imagination take the reins. I really like working with all these awesome rock and gravel textures that really add a lot to a gaming surface. If you're looking for some new terrain, definitely go check out our store. We 3D print a huge range of awesome quality terrain for Middle-earth and other tabletop games. I'll leave a link in the description, and anything you buy will greatly help me so I can spend more time making boards like this for the community and create these video tutorials so you can make the best quality terrain without making my mistakes. If you liked watching this, let me know what you think down in the comments, and please consider subscribing to this channel, as I'll be making heaps more from the world of Middle-earth, and I'd love your ideas of what I should make next. If you're in Australia and want to see some of these boards in real life, I'm sponsoring some events in the near future. All the details will be in the description and also over on our Facebook page. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked it, please let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.